There are places in the world where history doesn't just live, it waits. The Vatican is one of them. Behind its marble walls and gilded chapels lies a quieter city, one that doesn't appear on maps. It's a city of sealed drawers, unsigned letters, and corridors where the air feels older than the stone. Tonight, we're not chasing legends or spinning conspiracies. We're walking into the space between faith and power, where beauty and darkness share the same shelf. Some of what you'll hear is public record. Some has been whispered for centuries. All of it has been kept deliberately. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the hidden corners of history, you can like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I love seeing our map of night owls light up. There is a door in Vatican City that has no name, no plaque, no carved symbol to announce its purpose. It stands in shadow on a quiet side of the Apostolic Palace, overlooked by tourists and even by most clergy who pass through the courtyards above. Those who know of it rarely speak of it openly. The door leads not to a chapel or a meeting hall, but to a staircase that descends into the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The term secretum, in Latin, means personal or private, not necessarily hidden in the modern sense, yet the air inside feels like secrecy given form. Founded formally in 1612 under Pope Paul V, the archive contains centuries of papal correspondence, state documents, treaties, and letters exchanged with monarchs, emperors, and scholars. Only scholars with special approval may enter, and then only specific documents are made available. This door marks the threshold between the Vatican's public face and its internal memory. To stand before it is to feel the weight of decisions taken long before you were born and sealed long after you are gone. Inside, the temperature and humidity are carefully controlled to preserve parchment and ink, but the greater preservation is that of silence. Even when nothing is being moved or read, the place feels inhabited by the past, as though the documents themselves are aware of your presence. Beneath the Vatican's gardens and courtyards lies a room that very few people know exists, even among those who work within its walls. It is not listed on official floor plans, nor is it shown to visiting scholars. Archivists sometimes refer to it quietly as the Hall of Incomplete Justice. The room contains shelves lined with bound volumes of ecclesiastical trials that were never brought to a final verdict. Some concern clergy accused of heresy, misconduct, or defiance toward papal authority. Others involve political figures whose cases were heard under canon law. Many were abandoned mid-proceeding, leaving both accusation and defense suspended forever in the same pages. A trial against an archbishop in the 17th century is recorded in meticulous Latin, every witness statement copied by hand, yet the final ruling is missing. In another case, from the early 1800s, the transcripts detail weeks of testimony against a theologian suspected of promoting ideas later echoed in the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. His case ends abruptly with the notation cause deferred, without explanation. These are not records of justice denied in the modern sense, but of decisions set aside because the consequences of acting were judged more dangerous than the charges themselves. In certain instances, the accused died before judgment, yet their names were never cleared. The files remain locked, bound in leather or linen, their titles handwritten in the same careful script used for centuries in the Curia. Each is a story with no ending. preserved deliberately in its unfinished state. To read them is to sense the Vatican's preference, at times, for leaving certain questions unanswered, ensuring that the memory of the charge survives without the permanence of a verdict. In this way, silence becomes not absence, but a kind of verdict of its own. In a tall cabinet near the far end of one reading chamber is a drawer filled entirely with letters that were never sent. The envelopes bear no stamps, only the ornate handwriting of secretaries who copied the words of popes, cardinals, and diplomats onto heavy cream-colored paper. Some are addressed to emperors and kings, others to scholars, bishops, and even outspoken critics of the Church. The oldest dates to the late 15th century, written during the papacy of Alexander VI, intended for the King of France, but marked in the margin with a brief note in Latin retained. A few centuries later, another letter, drafted in the measured tones of Pope Benedict XIV, was meant for a reform-minded cardinal, but halted before sealing. In the early 20th century, a message to a European monarch under rising political threat was composed with urgent appeals for cooperation, only to be tucked into this same drawer and left there. The reasons for holding them vary. Sometimes circumstances changed before delivery, rendering the contents dangerous or obsolete. At other times, the tome may have been judged too conciliatory or too severe, risking a political shift the Vatican wished to avoid. Yet these letters were never destroyed. They remain preserved in their original folds, the wax seals unused, the ink still deep and legible. The act of keeping them speaks to an awareness that these words still carried weight, even in silence. A letter never sent cannot shape history in the moment, but in the archive, it becomes something else entirely, a record of hesitation, a crossroad preserved. Each one is a fragment of the Vatican's unwritten history, a path that was considered and then quietly abandoned, yet not allowed to disappear. The name Galileo Galilei has long been tied to one of the most famous conflicts between science and the Church. In the public record, the story is simple enough. By the early 17th century, Galileo's observations with a telescope supported the heliocentric model first advanced by Copernicus, placing the sun rather than the earth at the center of the known universe. In 1616, the Church formally declared the teaching formally heretical, citing its contradiction with Scripture as then interpreted. In 1633, Galileo was tried by the Roman Inquisition, found vehemently suspect of heresy, and forced to recant, spending the remainder of his life under house arrest. But inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive lies a thicker, more complicated record. The Galileo file contains not only the trial transcripts, but internal notes exchanged among cardinals, theologians, and papal advisors. In the margins, some voices urge a softer approach, suggesting that Galileo's work could be reconciled with faith if framed carefully. Others warn that accepting his ideas would undermine the Church's authority over the interpretation of Scripture. One memorandum dated shortly before the trial bluntly states, "To allow this is to unseat the axis of our teaching." The preserved correspondence reveals a struggle less about the science itself and more about the balance of power and control over truth. Galileo's original letter to Grand Duchess Christina of Tuscany, defending his position with both scientific and theological reasoning, is there too, stored in a flat archival box. Though the Church publicly cleared Galileo's name in 1992 under Pope John Paul II, the file remains intact, every hesitation and crossed-out phrase preserved. It stands as both a record of a turning point in human understanding and a quiet acknowledgement of how slowly institutions yield to change. In a climate-controlled drawer near the cartographic section of the Vatican Apostolic Archive rests a vellum map that should not exist. Its edges are frayed, the ink browned by centuries, but its details remain sharp. Drawn in the late 13th century, it depicts a fortified stronghold known to history as Montségur, the final refuge of the Cathars. Official records state that in 1244, after a siege lasting months, the fortress fell and more than 200 defenders were executed by burning. No survivors were recorded, and no escape routes were ever acknowledged. Yet, on this map, near the base of the mountain, a narrow corridor is inked in darker lines, extending away from the main structure and vanishing into the surrounding terrain. The passage bears no label, no note, yet its deliberate inclusion suggests a purpose. Montségur's surviving plans in public archives make no mention of such a feature. Whether it was a true escape route, an unfinished tunnel, or simply the cartographer's invention is impossible to say. What is certain is that the Vatican preserved it, folding it carefully between unrelated fortress diagrams, as if to hide it in plain sight. Over centuries, the folds have worn thin, but the image endures. Perhaps it was kept as a curiosity, perhaps as quiet evidence that history's absolutes are not always complete. The map does not prove that anyone escaped, nor does it erase the tragedy of the siege, but its existence introduces a sliver of possibility into a story long thought closed. In the silence of the archive, that possibility feels almost alive, as though someone, somewhere, may have carried a memory the Church never intended to let go entirely. Among the more human corners of the Vatican Apostolic Archive lies a section devoted to causes for sainthood that never reached canonization. The process, known formally as canonization, requires a careful investigation of a person's life, writings, and reported miracles, often stretching over decades or centuries. Many of the files in this section belong to figures whose devotion was unquestioned, whose acts of charity or sacrifice matched the lives of those later declared saints. Yet something in their story prevented the final step. In one folder from the 16th century, a Spanish priest is praised in parish records for ministering to plague victims when others fled. Witness statements attest to a healing attributed to his prayers, but a handwritten note, unsigned, remarks that he had shown excessive mercy to those under sentence, a decision apparently viewed as a breach of discipline. Another case from the 19th century concerns a Bavarian mystic who claimed visions of the Virgin Mary. Her accounts were consistent, poetic, and deeply rooted in Catholic tradition, yet they also included gentle criticisms of clerical authority. Letters of support from local priests fill her file, but the Vatican's final notation reads simply, "Cause deferred." Once deferred, such cases are rarely reopened. These names do not appear in public databases of saints or blesseds. They exist here only in bound dossiers, linen-covered and marked in elegant script. The Vatican's decision to preserve these files rather than destroy them suggests a reluctance to erase the memory entirely, even when official recognition is withheld. In these pages, grace and caution meet, leaving lives of extraordinary faith suspended in a permanent in-between, remembered but never raised to the altars. In a small, dimly lit storage room off one of the archive's restricted corridors, there are folders bound in linen rather than leather. They hold paintings, sketches, and small panels that have never hung in churches or galleries. Some were commissioned privately by popes or cardinals. Others were quietly acquired after being deemed unsuitable for public devotion. A few bear the signatures of known artists, while others are unsigned but clearly the work of skilled hands. The common thread is their subject matter. One sketch attributed to a student of Caravaggio depicts a figure in papal robes, not in blessing but in despair, surrounded by empty pews and shadows that seem almost to encroach. Another oil painting shows Mary weeping, not at the cross, but before a locked cathedral door. In several works, halos have been darkened or eyes scratched out, evidence of alteration by later hands. These are not heretical images, but they resist the simplicity of triumphal faith. They reveal moments when devotion and doubt share the same frame, a kind of visual confession not meant for liturgy. A Vatican archivist once remarked that these pieces were too true to be useful, meaning they captured emotions the church could not display without unsettling the faithful. Each artwork is wrapped in tissue, sandwiched between sheets of velvet, and stored with the same care given to illuminated manuscripts. By keeping them here, the Vatican neither destroys nor endorses them. They remain in waiting, preserved for a time when perhaps such unvarnished depictions of belief might be received without scandal. Until then, they stay in their linen folders, their images unseen, their silence as deliberate as any decree. Tucked deep within the Vatican Apostolic Archive is a document known to scholars as the Chinon Parchment. For centuries, the fate of the Knights Templar was told as a story of condemnation. Arrested in 1307 under orders from King Philip IV of France, accused of heresy, blasphemy, and secret crimes, and ultimately executed or imprisoned after confessions extracted under torture. The Church, it was said, had joined in their downfall without hesitation. Yet the Chinon parchment, discovered by researchers in the early 21st century but preserved quietly in the Vatican for centuries, tells a different account. Signed in August 1308 by papal envoys and bearing the name of Pope Clement V, it records a formal absolution of the Templar leadership from charges of heresy. The document acknowledges irregular practices within the order, but stops short of declaring them heretical, instead urging reconciliation and penance. Despite this absolution, the suppression of the order continued, driven largely by Philip's political and financial ambitions. The parchment was folded and stored, its contents known only to those within the Curia, while the public narrative of guilt remained unchallenged. Even after its modern rediscovery, the Vatican did not present it as a dramatic revelation, perhaps because it complicates a story long settled in popular imagination. In the archive, it rests beside transcripts of private discussions between papal advisors who weighed the danger of revealing mercy in the face of royal pressure. One line in those notes reads, "To proclaim this now is to invite ruin." It is a reminder that sometimes the Church's silence is not an absence of knowledge, but a choice to protect itself from forces it cannot outmatch. In a narrow drawer, marked only with a faded number, are bundles of letters bound with ribbon, each written in different hands, but sharing a common theme. They are accounts of visions, moments when individuals claim to have seen figures of light, heard voices, or received messages they believed came from the divine. Most are from the 19th and early 20th centuries, though a few reach back further. Some describe apparitions of Mary or Christ in settings far from famous pilgrimage sites, often to people with no influence or public standing. A woman from southern Italy wrote in clear, steady prose of seeing a figure wreathed in smoke and fire, who spoke of a wound in the church that could not be healed by scripture alone. Another letter from rural France describes a child's repeated dreams of an angel warning of famine. Attached to each of these letters is a formal Vatican reply brief, polite and final. The writers are thanked, assured that their accounts have been noted and will be handled by the appropriate office, but no further investigation appears in the files. There is no sign that these reports were condemned or dismissed outright. Instead, they were preserved, stored in quiet isolation, without official recognition. It is as if the Church, unsure whether to accept or reject them, chose a third path to remember them in silence. In this way, the visions remain alive only in these pages, sealed from public devotion yet spared from oblivion. Their presence in the archive suggests that not all matters of faith are resolved by proclamation. Some are left to wait, suspended between reverence and doubt, for a time when the world may be ready to hear them without fear. In the cartographic section of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, many drawers contain maps of dioceses, kingdoms, and missions, long since altered or erased by war, politics, or time. Most are drawn on vellum or heavy paper, their ink still sharp, their lines measured with a precision that speaks to the importance of territory in the Church's history. Among them are maps marked with small golden crosses to indicate the seat of a bishop or the presence of a monastery. Some show dioceses that no longer exist, their names faded from living memory. A 15th century map of the Languedoc region in France bears a faint red notation in Latin that translates simply as diocese no longer recognized, offering no reason, no account of what led to its removal. Another map, this one a floor plan rather than a geographic chart, shows a medieval monastery with its chapels, cloisters, and refectories labeled in careful script. At first glance, it is like any other ecclesiastical plan, but near the edge, a corridor extends beyond the outer wall into unmarked space. It is drawn darker than the rest, as though the cartographer wished to emphasize it without explaining it. The monastery, identified in the margin as Montarreal, was destroyed during the Albigensian Crusade in the early 13th century, and official histories make no mention of survivors. Yet here is a plan that hints at a way out, or perhaps at a space meant for concealment. The Vatican has never displayed these maps, but it has preserved them with care, suggesting they hold value beyond their geography. In an age when the world's surface has been charted by satellites, these hand-drawn images are a quiet reminder that not all truths are visible from above. In one unassuming archival box, tucked between ledgers of papal appointments, lies a file with no crest, no official seal, and a name that appears only in faded ink. It concerns a pope whose reign was so brief and so clouded in uncertainty that he is absent from many official lists. The events it records date to the early Middle Ages, a period when papal succession was often contested by rival factions of clergy, nobility, and, at times, foreign powers. According to fragmentary notes, This man was elected in a hurried conclave, his legitimacy recognized only by a portion of the Roman clergy. Within weeks, his authority was challenged, and another candidate was proclaimed pope in his place. The file contains no detailed biography, only short memoranda, fragments of correspondence, and an inventory of possessions returned to his family. There is no decree of deposition, no formal condemnation. It is as if his time in office was quietly set aside, neither wholly denied nor officially affirmed. Some historians suspect he may have been an antipope, a rival claimant during one of the Church's more turbulent periods, though the archive refrains from labeling him as such. The preservation of this file suggests that the Vatican, while choosing not to recognize him in its public chronology, has not erased him entirely. His name remains legible on the folder's spine, his existence acknowledged in silence. In the world beyond these walls, he is almost entirely forgotten. But here, among the shelves, his brief and contested tenure still casts a faint shadow over the narrative of uninterrupted papal succession. Far below the marble floors of the Apostolic Palace lies a section of the archive, rarely opened even for approved scholars. It contains reports and correspondence from conflicts in which the Vatican played no open role, yet exerted influence in ways that left no battlefield markers and no official declarations of war. These were struggles of diplomacy, persuasion, and strategic alliance, often unfolding in the shadows while empires clashed in the light. One leather-bound volume from the late 16th century contains letters to papal envoys in the court of Philip II of Spain, urging subtle support for Catholic resistance movements in Protestant-held territories. Another file from the early 19th century documents quiet assistance to anti-clerical governments in exchange for the preservation of certain religious freedoms agreements kept far from the public eye. The language in these documents is careful, layered in polite formality, but between the lines it is clear that the Vatican was navigating an intricate web of influence, seeking to preserve the Church's position regardless of which banners flew over capitals. In some cases, there are records of financial aid routed through religious orders to reach sympathetic leaders, their purposes disguised as charitable works. Elsewhere, memoranda advise withholding support from allies whose actions had grown too severe, even at the risk of losing ground politically. These were not wars waged with armies, but contests of patience, information, and quiet pressure. The absence of battlefields makes them easy to overlook in the larger sweep of history. Yet the archive preserves them as moments when the Church's role was neither passive nor visible. In these shelves, the Vatican's influence appears not as a voice from the pulpit, but as a whisper in the council chamber. Beneath one of the Vatican's lesser-known chapels is a crypt not open to the public. Its entrance is hidden behind a locked iron grate, accessible only by a narrow stone stairway worn smooth with age. Inside, the air is cool and heavy, and the chamber is lined with simple niches, each holding human remains. None bear names. Instead, some are marked only with dates, others with brief Latin inscriptions, such as Miles Fidei Soldier of the Faith or Servus Ecclesiae Servant of the Church. The archive holds a small leather portfolio that corresponds to this crypt, containing records of those buried here. Many appear to be clergy who died in Rome, far from their homelands. Men who had served in missions or diplomatic posts, but whose deaths occurred quietly, without ceremony. Others are identified only by the place of death, and a few lines of description, often with no cause recorded. One entry from the 17th century notes a man found lifeless in his quarters during the summer heat, his identity unknown, yet his remains interred with honor in the crypt. There is no clear reason why these individuals were buried without markers, or why their identities, in some cases, were never pursued. The chamber itself is stark, without frescoes or ornament, and its silence feels intentional rather than neglected. The Vatican has preserved the records with the same care it gives to the grand tombs of popes, suggesting that anonymity here is not a mark of disgrace, but of deliberate discretion. In this place, the absence of a name is as much a part of the memory as the remains themselves, leaving a question that will never be fully answered. Among the Vatican's most closely guarded collections is the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the historical list of books forbidden to Catholics. First issued in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, and maintained until its formal abolition in 1966. The index publicly named works judged harmful to faith or morals, ranging from heretical theological treatises to political writings. But in the depths of the archive exists a quieter, unpublished register, a list without official numbering or public announcement. This list is not bound in leather like the public volumes, but kept in loose folios within a locked cabinet. Its entries are written in a discreet hand, often with only the author's name, the title, and the notation reternary to be retained. Some of the works here never appeared on the public index at all. They include manuscripts circulated privately among clergy, philosophical essays from Catholic scholars who questioned official interpretations, and accounts of events the Church preferred not to acknowledge. One 17th century entry refers to a travel journal describing missionary activity in Asia that conflicts with official reports. Another notes a set of letters between bishops debating the morality of certain colonial policies, never printed but preserved in secret. The inclusion of these works in a hidden list, rather than in the public index, allowed the Vatican to quietly control their circulation without attracting attention. Their presence here reveals a different kind of censorship, one aimed not at condemning ideas openly, but at containing them silently. Though the formal index has been gone for decades, this shadow register remains sealed away, its contents rarely examined even by those with access. It is a reminder that not all suppression is visible, and that some books are locked away not to erase them, but to ensure they never reach the wrong hands. In a long, narrow drawer, deep within the diplomatic archives, are bundles of parchment tied with silk cords, each one marked Concordata Privata. These are agreements between the Holy See and secular powers, negotiated outside a public gaze. Concordats have long been tools by which the Vatican defines its rights and privileges in foreign states, covering matters such as the appointment of bishops, the status of church property, and the freedom to operate schools or charitable institutions. The agreements in this private collection, however, differ from those made public. Many date to the 20th century, including years when Europe was shadowed by authoritarian regimes. One unsigned draft from the 1930s details proposed terms with a European government known for strict censorship and repression. In exchange for protection of Catholic institutions, the Vatican would refrain from public criticism of certain domestic policies, though those policies are not named in the main text. A separate annotation in a different hand lists them plainly. The dissolution of religious schools deemed politically suspect, surveillance of clergy from minority backgrounds, and limitations on religious press. Other files describe negotiations with Latin American governments during the 1970s, where human rights abuses were well documented, yet agreements were considered to preserve the Church's presence. The language is precise, never accusatory, and carefully avoids moral judgment, focusing instead on guarantees and exemptions. These documents suggest a pragmatic approach to survival, choosing influence from within over confrontation from without. The Vatican has never officially acknowledged these specific drafts, yet they are preserved with the same care as signed treaties, a testament to the delicate and sometimes uneasy balance between faith and political necessity. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. From 1870 until 1929, the popes lived in what became known as the prisoner in the Vatican era. This began when the Kingdom of Italy seized the Papal States, leaving the Holy See without temporal territory. Successive popes refused to recognize the authority of the Italian government over Rome and would not step beyond the Vatican's walls. Publicly, it was a period of silence and seclusion, yet the archives tell a different story. In a tall cabinet labeled simply Privata Correspondenza, letters from these decades reveal a papacy still deeply engaged in global affairs. Correspondence with Austria discusses education reforms in Eastern Europe, proposing that the Vatican supply teachers and curriculum guidance in exchange for preserving Catholic identity. A memorandum to the Spanish crown outlines strategies for maintaining religious authority in colonies experiencing unrest, urging discreet cooperation with sympathetic governors. One unsigned draft, dated 1922, is addressed to the President of the United States, offering the Vatican's assistance as an intermediary in post-war European negotiations. The draft praises the nation's growing influence and appeals to shared moral heritage, though in faint Latin script. On the reverse is written sub condition futura, under future conditions, suggesting it was to be sent only when political circumstances shifted. None of these letters appear in public diplomatic records from the period. The public image of the Vatican as politically isolated belies the quiet network of influence it maintained, relying on trusted envoys, coded messages, and personal appeals. When the Lateran Treaty of 1929 restored the Vatican's sovereignty, these decades of unseen diplomacy were folded neatly into the archive, preserved not as open triumphs but as proof that the Holy See had never been truly still. Among the lesser-known shelves of the Vatican Apostolic Archive are files dedicated to women whose contributions to the Church have been largely forgotten. Some were nuns, others mystics, and a few were lay scholars whose writings found their way into the hands of theologians. In the Middle Ages, female voices in theology were rare, and even rarer were those preserved. Yet here are manuscripts copied in careful script, letters in which women describe visions, debate doctrine, or advise bishops on matters of conscience. One 14th century file contains the correspondence of a Benedictine nun in northern Italy who wrote extensively about reforming monastic life. Her proposals were practical and deeply rooted in Scripture, yet they were quietly set aside, likely because they challenged the authority of male superiors. Another file from the 17th century contains the poetry and meditations of a woman from Bavaria who had never taken vows but was widely respected for her piety. Her works explore the nature of grace with unusual intimacy, blending personal reflection with theological insight. Though praised privately by several priests, her writings were never approved for publication. Many of these women lived and died without public recognition, their influence limited to those who read their words in private. The Vatican preserved these records not as celebrated achievements, but as careful acknowledgments of voices that did not fit comfortably into the official narrative. To hold these pages is to sense both the depth of faith they carried and the quiet boundaries they encountered. In the stillness of the archive, their presence is a reminder that the Church's memory contains not only the voices it chose to amplify, but also those it chose to keep in the shadows, waiting for a different time to be heard. In one of the archive's oldest manuscript cases lies a single parchment leaf, unlike any other in the collection. It is written in Greek on one side, Latin on the other, in a hand that suggests it dates to the early centuries of the Church. The Latin text is a translation of the Greek, though certain words and phrases are rendered differently, as if the translator were interpreting rather than merely copying. Both sides contain a passage that does not match any chapter or verse of the canonical Gospels. It recounts a conversation between Jesus and a disciple about the nature of mercy, with an emphasis on forgiveness extended without condition, even to those who reject it. The style is consistent with early Christian writings, though there is no clear indication of authorship. Marginal notes in Latin, added centuries later, suggest that the passage was once considered for inclusion in a scriptural compilation, but was set aside. One annotation reads, "Non canonizandum," not to be canonized. The reasons are not recorded, though scholars who have seen the fragment speculate that its message, while theologically sound, may have been considered too unqualified, potentially undermining teachings on repentance and penance. The leaf is preserved between sheets of protective paper, stored in a narrow folder with a simple label, Evangelium non receptum, the Gospel not received. It is not presented as heretical, nor as apocryphal in the usual sense, but as something the Church chose not to adopt. Its survival in the Vatican's care suggests that, even when a text is excluded from public doctrine, it may still be valued as part of the broader, more complex story of faith's early expression. In a thin folder marked only with the date 1531 lies a draft letter that could have altered the course of the Reformation. It is written in Latin, in the precise hand of a papal secretary, addressed not to a monarch or bishop, but directly to Martin Luther. The tone is measured, respectful, and notably free of the sharp condemnations that marked most official communications with Protestant leaders at the time. It acknowledges points of dispute, the sale of indulgences, the language of the liturgy, the celibacy of the clergy, but proposes limited concessions in the hope of preserving unity. The draft suggests allowing the use of the vernacular in certain parts of the Mass, reducing the financial burden of indulgences, and opening further discussion on clerical marriage. In the margin, a later hand has added cautious notes, advising that such language could be interpreted as weakness. Alongside the draft is a second sheet, bearing a short, firm rejection. Non mittendum, not to be sent. The Reformation continued to spread, divisions hardened, and whatever chance there might have been for reconciliation at that stage disappeared. The preservation of this letter is striking. It was not destroyed, nor was it hidden away in unrelated files. Instead, it remains in its own folder. A. The record of a road the Church chose not to take. Holding it, one senses not only the theological divide, but also the weight of institutional pride and the fear that compromise might fracture authority beyond repair. It is a reminder that sometimes the most consequential decisions in history are those to say nothing at all, even when words have already been carefully chosen. In a long, low shelf near the section reserved for missionary records rests a series of slim, linen-bound files labeled Martyrs non proclamati, Martyrs not proclaimed. Each contains accounts of men and women who died for their faith, yet whose names were never added to the official rolls of martyrs recognized by the Church. Some died in regions where open hostility to Christianity made public recognition dangerous for the living. Others perished in politically sensitive contexts where acknowledging them could have strained alliances or provoked retaliation. A file from the early 18th century records the fate of a missionary in North Africa who refused to renounce his faith before local authorities and was executed by beheading. Witness statements affirm his steadfastness, yet a note from a Vatican advisor cautions that proclaiming his martyrdom might endanger other missionaries in the region. Another file, from the mid-20th century, concerns a bishop killed under an authoritarian regime. Local clergy petitioned for his recognition, but the process was quietly halted, likely to preserve the Church's legal standing in the country. These decisions are not recorded as denials, but as indefinite delays, leaving the names in a state of suspended remembrance. In the archive, the files are stored with the same care as those of canonized saints' parchment pages, wrapped in tissue, ink kept from fading by controlled light and air. They are neither forgotten nor celebrated, existing in the narrow space between private honor and public acknowledgement. Here, memory is preserved without the full recognition that turns it into tradition, as if the Church is waiting for a time when remembering openly will no longer carry a cost. In a small locked cabinet within the diplomatic archives lies a collection of documents, unlike the formal treaties and correspondence that fill the surrounding shelves. These are travel papers, passports, and letters of passage issued under assumed names to Vatican envoys sent into regions hostile to the Church. Some are from the 19th century, when missionaries and clergy traveled to territories where anti-clerical laws were in force, their presence tolerated only under false identities. Others date to the early years of the Cold War, when priests entered Eastern Bloc countries disguised as traders, academics, or aid workers. A faded passport from 1954 bears the photograph of a man identified as a cultural liaison, but the accompanying notes reveal he was in fact a Jesuit priest, tasked with discreetly supporting underground Catholic communities. Another set of documents from the late 19th century is written in French and identifies the bearer as an agricultural surveyor, though the file shows he was carrying coded reports from a mission in North Africa. The creation of such identities required cooperation from sympathetic governments and the skill of Vatican scribes who could produce convincing papers without leaving a trace in official records. These missions rarely appear in public accounts, yet the documents themselves show the extent to which the Church was willing to adapt in order to maintain a presence in places where open ministry was impossible. Each forged or altered paper is now preserved in perfect order, a quiet testament to lives lived under borrowed names, where faith and secrecy had to walk together, unseen by those outside the mission's circle. Near the center of the Vatican Apostolic Archive is a tall iron cabinet with drawers that slide heavily on their tracks. Inside are bundles of letters written in cipher, their lines a maze of symbols, numbers, and shifting alphabets. Some are accompanied by the original cipher keys, while others remain without explanation, their contents unread since the day they were sealed. The oldest examples date to the 16th century, when papal envoys communicated with distant courts during the religious upheavals of the Reformation. Others are from the turbulent decades of the 19th century, when the papal states were under threat and every political alliance required careful secrecy. A group of letters from 1942 is written in a cipher that appears to combine Latin phrases with numerical codes, likely to mask sensitive wartime communications. One note, partially decoded in the 1970s by a Vatican archivist, appears to describe movements of clergy in occupied territories, though the exact names and locations remain unclear. The presence of undeciphered letters in the same drawers suggests that some codes were so personal or so limited in circulation that their meaning has been lost entirely. Even without knowing the exact words, the physicality of the letters speaks to the urgency they once carried, folded and sealed in haste, smudged where ink met damp fingers. They are tangible reminders that the Vatican's role in global affairs often moved along channels invisible to the public eye. Whether they conceal urgent pleas, delicate negotiations, or warnings that never reached their intended recipients, they remain preserved exactly as they were found, holding their secrets as tightly as the day they were written. In a narrow velvet-lined drawer in the personal archives section rests a single folded parchment, sealed with dark red wax that has cracked with age. There is no name on the outside, only the notation Confessio Privata in a careful 16th century hand. Inside, the ink has browned, and the Latin text is written in a tense, deliberate script. It is a confession, but the writer does not identify themselves. The tone is urgent, yet restrained, as if the author expected the words to be read by only one person and then destroyed. The contents allude to actions taken at the highest levels of church governance, choices that placed political survival over moral obligation. Certain phrases, "I feared losing the chair itself," and "I weighed the soul of the world against the preservation of the church," suggest that the writer held considerable authority. Marginal notes by a later archivist indicate that the confession was delivered to a senior cardinal in Rome and somehow preserved rather than burned, though no explanation is given. There are no signatures, no dates beyond the century suggested by the handwriting and materials. The absence of identifying details seems deliberate, an act of both self-protection and symbolic anonymity, as though the confession was meant to speak for more than one person's burden. It is kept under close restriction, rarely shown even to authorized researchers, perhaps because its contents are as much an indictment of the institution as they are a record of personal guilt. In its silence, it raises the question of how many other such confessions were made and how many found their way into the fire instead of the archive. On a high shelf in the architectural archives rests a rolled set of parchment plans bound with faded blue ribbon. The outer label gives only a place name, written in Latin, and the year 1723. Unrolled, the drawings reveal the floor plan of a monastic complex: chapels, cloisters, dormitories, gardens, rendered with the precision of an experienced surveyor. Yet there is no record of this monastery in official church directories for the period. The surrounding, Countryside is detailed, with farm plots, wells, and a nearby river carefully marked. But no modern maps place such a structure in the named location. Marginal notes suggest alterations to the building that were never carried out, and the lower corner bears a faint annotation in Italian translating to location to remain undisclosed. Archivists have found no evidence that the monastery was ever built, nor that the land was consecrated. One theory is that the plans were deliberately created under a false name to mask the identity of an existing religious house, perhaps one sheltering individuals the authorities could not openly protect. Another possibility is that the monastery was planned but abandoned for political reasons, leaving only these drawings as proof of its intended existence. The precision of the work indicates the plans were approved at a high level, and their preservation suggests that the Vatican valued them even in cancellation. The rolled parchment is stored away from public display, its details known to only a few, raising the quiet possibility that it represents not just a building, but an episode the Church chose to keep unrecorded in every way but this. In one of the archive's larger storage rooms, there is a wooden chest reinforced with iron bands. Its lid marks simply post reditus after the return. Inside are inventories and correspondence from the early 19th century, documenting the materials taken from the Vatican during Napoleon's occupation of Rome between 1809 and 1814. During that period, French forces under direct orders from Paris seized thousands of manuscripts, maps, and relics, creating them for transport over the Alps to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. The records here were compiled by Vatican clerks instructed to list each item before it left Rome, their handwriting growing tighter and more hurried as the work went on. Descriptions range from detailed chalice of silver with gilded rim, gift of the Queen of Poland, 1683, to starkly brief volumes IX7, private correspondence, papal succession, do not separate. After Napoleon's defeat, much of the archive was returned under the terms of the Congress of Vienna. Yet, not all came back. Some items were lost in transit, others absorbed into French collections, and a few disappeared into private hands. The post-Reditus files record not only what was recovered, but also what remained missing. Marginal notes in Italian and Latin express frustration at irretrievable losses, while one final entry in a clerk's hand reads, "We have regained the pages, but not the soul." The chest itself is not grand, but it carries the weight of a chapter when the Vatican's memory was physically uprooted, scattered, and only partially restored. Its presence here is both a record of loss and an assertion of endurance, preserving even the list of what could not be reclaimed. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. In a section of the archive labeled Missiones Interdictae Forbidden Missions are bound reports from Jesuit and other Catholic missionaries who operated in territories where the faith was officially banned. Many of these records come from the 17th and 18th centuries, when the Jesuits in particular were active in Asia, often working under the constant threat of expulsion or death. One set of documents describes activity in Japan after the Tokugawa shogunate outlawed Christianity in the early 1600s. The missionaries traveled disguised as traders or artisans, ministering secretly to hidden communities of believers known as Kakure Kirishitan. Another file details a clandestine mission in the highlands of Vietnam, where priests used local festivals as cover for gathering congregations. Reports from the Ottoman Empire show careful negotiation with local authorities to allow Catholic worship under the guise of private gatherings. The accounts are written in a restrained factual tone, but between the lines they reveal the peril in which these missionaries lived. Some conclude abruptly, the final entry dated days or weeks before the writer's disappearance. In a few cases, letters from survivors describe the capture and execution of their companions. These missions were rarely mentioned in public records, both to protect those involved and to avoid provoking political powers. The Vatican preserved their reports with remarkable care, binding them in linen and storing them in climate-controlled cabinets. By keeping these files intact, the Church acknowledged their work without exposing it, honoring their persistence in places where faith could not be practiced openly. In these pages, the quiet endurance of belief is recorded not through sermons or proclamations, but through the simple act of surviving in secrecy. In a long drawer marked Orientalia Ecclesiae, the Vatican preserves a series of remarkable exchanges between the Holy See and the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan. The letters date from the early 1600s, when Japan had begun its policy of sakoku, the long period of national isolation that included the prohibition of Christianity. Written in Portuguese by interpreters serving both sides, the correspondence reveals a dialogue far more measured than the violent suppression usually associated with the era. One letter, believed to have been dictated by Tokugawa Ieyasu himself around 1611, acknowledges the intelligence and discipline of Christian missionaries, but rejects the religion's disruptive effect on Japanese social order. It warns that a faith dividing fathers from sons cannot be allowed to take root, a sentiment delivered without insult, but with firm resolve. Alongside, it is an unsent Vatican draft, written in formal, respectful Latin, offering theological explanations and praising Japanese traditions for their sense of duty and honor. At the bottom, in red ink, a single phrase is written: non mittendum, periculosum, not to be sent, too dangerous. It seems the decision was made to end the exchange rather than risk inflaming a volatile situation. That choice effectively closed a rare moment when mutual understanding might have grown, even in the absence of agreement. The letters were folded into silk covers and stored together, perhaps because they represent not merely a failed negotiation, but a fleeting instance where two worlds regarded each other without immediate violence. Here, preserved in their original hand, is evidence that even in an age of persecution, there were moments when dialogue was possible, if only for a breath. In a small, climate-controlled cabinet labeled Astronomia Sacra, there are bound volumes of star charts produced by Jesuit astronomers in China during the 17th and 18th centuries. These charts, drawn with extraordinary precision, were part of the scientific exchange fostered by the Jesuit missions under the patronage of the Ming and later Qing emperors. Figures such as Matteo Ricci and Adam Schall von Bell introduced European astronomical methods to the imperial court, blending them with Chinese observational traditions. One chart dated 1702 is an intricate map of the northern sky, annotated in both Latin and classical Chinese, showing constellations from both traditions side by side. Notes in the margins discuss the correction of the Chinese lunar calendar, a reform that earned the Jesuits considerable influence in the court's Bureau of Astronomy. Yet these same charts were later recalled to Rome after disputes over the so-called Chinese rice controversy, when disagreements about how much local culture could be incorporated into Catholic practice led to a papal decree restricting certain accommodations. The return of these documents to the Vatican was quiet, perhaps to avoid suggesting that the mission's scientific achievements had been overshadowed by theological conflict. Today, the charts rest in archival boxes lined with acid-free paper, the colors of their ink still vivid after centuries. They are a testament to a time when the Church's reach extended not only through doctrine but through the patient work of science, mapping the heavens in collaboration with distant cultures. They also serve as a reminder that even in moments of genuine exchange, the balance between faith and cultural adaptation could shift abruptly, ending a dialogue that had once seemed limitless. Deep in the section reserved for Acta Secreta, Secret Acts, lies a slim leather-bound volume containing transcripts of private audiences between Pope Pius XII and select diplomats during the Second World War. The conversations, recorded in precise Latin shorthand by papal aides, offer a rare glimpse into the delicate balance the Vatican sought to maintain while much of Europe was engulfed in conflict. One transcript from 1942 details a meeting with a representative of the German Reich, during which the Pope voiced concern over reports of mass deportations from occupied territories. The envoy responded with vague assurances and deflections, while the Pope pressed for the preservation of human dignity and life without discrimination. Another meeting, days later, records a discussion with an allied diplomat urging the Vatican to take a public stand against the atrocities, warning that silence could be misread as indifference. The Pope's replies were cautious, reflecting fears that open condemnation might endanger Catholics in Axis-controlled regions and compromise diplomatic channels that were still being used to shelter refugees. The tone throughout is restrained, with each side choosing words carefully, knowing the transcripts would remain confidential. Yet the very act of recording these conversations and preserving them suggests the Vatican understood their long-term historical weight. Bound in calfskin and stored in a temperature-controlled vault, the volume remains accessible only to a small number of researchers, perhaps because it captures the Church at a moment when every word was a calculation, and the cost of speaking or remaining silent could not be measured until long after the war had ended. In a narrow wooden case marked Archivum Musicae Vetustae rests a collection of vellum-bound choir books whose pages have not been turned in centuries. They were copied by hand in the late 15th century for use in the Sistine Chapel, their illuminated initials painted with deep ultramarine and gold leaf. Each book contains polyphonic settings of the Mass and motets by composers such as Guillaume Dufay, Josquin des Prez, and early Roman masters whose names are now obscure. The margins bear faint notes from chapel singers, small symbols indicating breathing points or reminders about tempo, suggesting that these volumes were not simply ceremonial but in active use. One book, dated 1495, contains a unique setting of the Miserere attributed to a composer whose identity remains uncertain, though the style suggests an early influence on later masters like Palestrina. During the sack of Rome in 1527, when Swiss guards made their final stand in defense of Pope Clement VII, these choir books were hidden within a sealed chamber beneath the chapel floor to prevent them from being taken or destroyed. They remained there until the mid-19th century, when renovations uncovered them in remarkably good condition. Now, Each book is stored in its own custom-made box, the gold still gleaming under archival lighting. They are seldom performed from, partly to protect their fragile bindings, but also because the music they contain represents a living link to the private soundscape of the Renaissance papal court. In their silence, the books still carry the weight of voices once raised beneath Michelangelo's ceiling, a reminder that beauty itself can be guarded as carefully as any secret. Within the Vatican's scientific archives is a series of bound reports labeled Experimenta Naturae, compiled by members of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences during the 17th and 18th centuries. These documents record observations and experiments conducted under papal patronage, covering subjects from optics and magnetism to the properties of medicinal plants. Many of the contributors were clerics trained in mathematics and natural philosophy, working alongside lay scholars invited to Rome from across Europe. One file from 1674 describes a series of trials using polished lenses to concentrate sunlight for controlled burning, an investigation into the nature of heat and light. Another, dated 1712, contains carefully illustrated studies of South American cinchona bark, recognized for its effectiveness in treating fevers and early understanding of quinine's medicinal value. The tone of the reports is methodical, with results and failures noted side by side, reflecting an approach that valued precision over reputation. Yet some sections are marked non publicanda, meaning they were not to be published beyond the Vatican's walls. The reasons vary sometimes to protect the Church's intellectual advantage, sometimes because the findings touched on theological sensitivities. These volumes show the Vatican not as a passive observer of scientific progress, but as an active participant, investing in inquiry even when the work was not meant for public view. Stored now in climate-controlled cabinets, the ink and drawings remain vivid, the paper free from decay. They stand as evidence that the search for knowledge within the Vatican often moved in parallel to its spiritual mission, and sometimes, just as quietly, in directions the outside world was never meant to see. In a narrow folio cabinet labeled Cartographia Reservata are maps so rare they are rarely unrolled. These are hand-drawn charts from the 15th and 16th centuries, created in the age when European explorers were still sketching coastlines for the first time. Many of the maps came from Venetian, Portuguese, and Spanish pilots, acquired through diplomatic exchange or private commission for the papal court. One parchment chart, dated to around 1450, shows the western coast of Africa in striking detail. Decades before Portuguese explorers officially mapped it, another, from the early 16th century, depicts the Caribbean with islands named differently from those on later public maps, suggesting they were based on first-hand reports not yet released to royal or merchant navies. Some charts are annotated in Latin with cryptic notes, "Safe Harbor," or "Avoid shoals here" in handwriting, believed to belong to clerics who maintain correspondence with seafarers. There are also maps whose orientation is reversed, with south at the top, reflecting certain medieval traditions. Many of these charts were marked ad usum pontificis, meaning for the Pope's use only. This exclusivity would have made them valuable not only for spiritual governance of distant missions, but also for political influence in negotiations over newly claimed lands. Over time, the Vatican preserved them with the same care given to sacred manuscripts, sealing some in protective cases to prevent damage from air and light. Today, their vivid pigments and precise linework remain almost intact, a reminder that the Church once possessed geographical knowledge that could shape the ambitions of kings and merchants alike. In their quiet drawers, these maps still chart the edge of the known world as it once was. In the restricted theological section, under a simple label reading Scriptura Vetusta, lies a set of parchment fragments believed to be among the earliest Latin translations of certain apocryphal Gospels. The handwriting and linguistic style suggest they were copied in North Africa during the late 4th or early 5th century, a time when debates over the biblical canon were still unsettled. These fragments include partial narratives of the infancy of Jesus and sayings attributed to him that do not appear in the New Testament. Some passages are similar to those found in the Gospel of Thomas, though in a different order and with subtle variations in meaning. Marginal annotations in a later medieval hand indicate that these texts were known to European scholars, but eventually suppressed from public reading lists after official canon decisions. It is unclear exactly how the Vatican acquired them, though one theory is that they came from a monastic library dissolved during the Vandal invasions, later passed through Mediterranean trade before arriving in Rome. The fragments are mounted between sheets of clear archival vellum, kept under controlled humidity and light. Only a handful of scholars have examined them closely, as they remain under classification that restricts reproduction or public display. Their survival offers a rare glimpse into the diversity of early Christian writings and the choices made about which voices would be preserved in the biblical record. Whether they were excluded for doctrinal reasons, political unity, or simple lack of circulation, their preservation in this vault shows that the Vatican never entirely destroyed the writings it set aside. They remain as whispers from a time when the story of Christianity was still being written in many hands. Among the Vatican's diplomatic archives is a sealed bundle marked Concordata non signata, concordats not signed. These are draft treaties negotiated between the Holy See and various states that, for reasons left only partly recorded, never reached final agreement. The earliest in the bundle dates to 1570, intended to formalize relations between the Papal States and the Kingdom of Scotland under Mary, Queen of Scots. The text outlines mutual recognition, rights of clergy, and provisions for Catholic education, but marginal notes in Italian suggest hesitation over Scotland's political instability and the rising influence of Protestant factions. Another document, from 1816, reflects delicate talks between the Vatican and post-Napoleonic France, where the Church sought to regain property confiscated during the Revolution. The draft bears handwritten insertions proposing phased restitution, yet the margins contain terse comments like unacceptable and provokes Parliament. A more recent 20th century draft concerns an agreement with a small European republic over religious broadcasting rights, halted abruptly when a change in government ended the talks. These unsigned concordats are preserved with the same meticulous care as those that were enacted, perhaps because they represent missed moments when the Vatican's reach might have extended further, or its autonomy secured more firmly. Bound in protective folders, they are handled only by gloved archivists, each page revealing the intricate balance between diplomacy, doctrine, and shifting political realities. They remind us that history is shaped as much by what is not agreed upon as by the treaties that are signed. In the quiet of the archive, these unsent agreements speak of opportunities weighed, gambled, and ultimately set aside. In a locked cabinet labeled processes, canonizationes, rests the complete documentation of sainthood causes that were never concluded. These files span centuries, each containing testimonies, miracle investigations, and character examinations gathered to determine whether a candidate would be canonized. One dossier from the early 17th century concerns a Franciscan friar in the Spanish Philippines known for ministering to both colonists and indigenous communities. Witness statements describe unexplained healings and prophetic visions, yet political opposition from local authorities delayed the process until it quietly expired. Another file from the 19th century documents a missionary in the Congo who died protecting his parish during an outbreak of violence. The investigation found him virtuous, but the reported miracle attributed to him lacked sufficient verification under Vatican rules. Some cases reveal internal disagreements letters between theologians debating whether certain visions aligned with established doctrine or risked encouraging heterodox interpretations. In each file, the final page is stamped causa suspensa, indicating that the process was suspended indefinitely. These abandoned canonization causes are preserved alongside the successful ones, perhaps as a sign that the Church does not erase the memory of those it chose not to elevate. The handwriting of witnesses, the careful seals on official decrees, and the occasional pressed flowers between pages suggest that for many, the subject's sanctity was beyond doubt, even if formal recognition was withheld. In their stillness, these files testify to the complexity of sainthood, a process shaped not only by holiness, but by history, politics, and the limits of proof. A pause is good. But the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. In the Vatican's legal archives lies a bound series of volumes titled Crimina Clericalia, containing detailed records of ecclesiastical trials held over the last 6 centuries. These are not the public decrees or summaries that sometimes appeared in church bulletins, but the full transcripts, witness testimonies, and verdicts from cases judged by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and its predecessors. One volume from the late 15th century recounts the trial of a bishop accused of diverting funds from a hospital to finance private estates. Witnesses included monks, merchants, and even local townspeople, their depositions recorded in careful Latin. Another, dated 1732, details charges against a priest accused of using church property for personal profit through clandestine trade in colonial goods. Some entries concern heresy, others moral misconduct, and a few involve disputes over the legitimacy of ordinations. While many verdicts resulted in removal from office or penance, there are also cases where the accused were acquitted after lengthy proceedings, the court finding insufficient evidence or politically motivated charges. The margins of these documents sometimes contain notes by later archivists, evaluating the fairness of the trials in light of new canonical standards. These records were preserved not for public exposure, but for internal reference, ensuring that precedents and the mistakes of the past remained documented. Kept in a secure, temperature-controlled chamber, the vellum and paper have survived remarkably well. In their unembellished language, these trial records strip away the grandeur of the Vatican and reveal the institution grappling with the failings of its own members, balancing justice, mercy, and the pressures of its time. In a deep alcove of the Apostolic Library, behind a locked bronze gate, rests a group of manuscripts labeled Liturgiae, regionales. These are handwritten records of liturgical rites, once practiced in regions where Catholic worship adapted to local customs, some of which have since disappeared. A codex from the 10th century describes the Mozarabic rite as celebrated in the Iberian Peninsula under Muslim rule, complete with unique chants and prayers absent from the Roman tradition. Another manuscript, brought from Ethiopia in the 16th century, records a Catholic liturgy that blended elements of the ancient Ge'ez rite with Latin ceremonial structure. There is also a parchment from Kerala, India, detailing the Syro-Malabar tradition as it was observed before the Synod of Diamper in 1599, imposed Roman reforms. These manuscripts are richly decorated, some with miniature illustrations of processions, altars, and vestments that show a fusion of cultures in color and form. Marginal notes in later hands often mark certain prayers as corrected or to be conformed, reflecting gradual moves toward liturgical uniformity. Yet, their preservation here suggests that even when practices were changed or suppressed, the Vatican did not entirely erase them from memory. Instead, they remain as records of a time when the Catholic faith could take on different outward shapes while maintaining its core theology. Stored in low-light conditions to protect their pigments, the pages still carry the scent of the lands they came from, a faint reminder that the universal church was, for much of its history, a patchwork of voices, rhythms, and gestures now largely hidden from the modern sanctuary. In the Vatican's section devoted to early missionary correspondence is a leather portfolio labeled Epistolae ex Terra Australis. It contains letters from Jesuit and Benedictine missionaries who sailed to the Pacific and parts of Australia in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Most were never intended for public reading, instead sent to superiors in Rome to report on conditions, successes, and failures. One letter from 1803 describes the voyage from Lisbon to the coast of New Holland, noting encounters with Dutch and British ships and the scarcity of fresh water during the crossing. Another, dated 1821, details efforts to learn and record the languages of indigenous peoples in the Torres Strait, accompanied by small glossaries written in both Latin and the local tongues. There are vivid descriptions of landscapes unfamiliar to European eyes, red earth plains, eucalyptus forests, and skies unlike those of the Northern Hemisphere. Some letters reveal deep cultural misunderstandings, while others show genuine attempts at dialogue and respect. Yet many accounts also note the political tensions between Catholic missions and colonial administrations, particularly in territories under Protestant governance. A few letters end abruptly, with later annotations explaining that the sender died during the mission, sometimes from illness, sometimes in unexplained circumstances. Bound together in the portfolio, these letters preserve a fragile narrative of faith carried to the edge of the known world, where the Vatican's influence was stretched thin and the line between spiritual mission and political entanglement blurred. They remain as testimony to an era when Rome sought not only to guide the faithful across Europe, but to plant its presence on shores far beyond its sight. In a long oak case marked Numismata Sacra lies a collection of coins and medals struck under papal authority, many of which never entered general circulation. These pieces, some in gold and others in silver or bronze, date from the Middle Ages through the 20th century. Many were minted to commemorate specific events, jubilees, canonizations, or the completion of major works such as St. Peter's Basilica, but others appear to have been produced for diplomatic purposes. Intended as gifts to monarchs and envoys, a small gold coin from the pontificate of Pope Alexander VI bears an unusually detailed map of the Mediterranean on one side and the papal coat of arms on the other, suggesting its intended audience valued both piety and maritime influence. Another, from Pope Leo XIII's era, was struck in extremely limited numbers to mark the opening of the Vatican Observatory in 1891. Some medals depict scenes not found in other papal art, such as allegorical figures representing continents, a reminder of the Church's global aspirations. A few carry inscriptions in languages other than Latin or Italian, tailored for the recipients: French for diplomatic gifts to Paris, Polish for missions to Krakow. Many of these coins were never released publicly, their existence known only to a small circle within the Curia. Over time, they became quiet records of moments the Vatican chose to commemorate privately rather than through proclamations. Today, they rest in padded trays within a humidity-controlled vault, each labeled and catalogued, their luster still intact. Together they form a silent treasury, where metal and minting tell stories as deliberately as ink and parchment. Within a narrow drawer of the Vatican's restricted photographic archive lies a series of glass plate negatives labeled Missiones Orientalis 1895, 1910. These fragile plates, each stored in a paper sleeve, were taken by priests, scholars, and lay photographers who traveled through the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia under Vatican sponsorship. The images capture a world on the cusp of change. Ancient cities before modern development, desert monasteries still occupied by their original communities, and marketplaces that have since vanished beneath new roads. One plate shows the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem before its 20th century restorations, the facade darkened by centuries of soot. Another depicts the Coptic monasteries of the Wadi Natron in Egypt, their high mud brick walls rising against the desert horizon. There are also intimate portraits: Armenian clergy in embroidered vestments, Maronite villagers gathered after Mass, and young seminarians studying under palm trees. Many of these photographs were intended as internal reference for the Propaganda Fide, the Vatican's missionary office, to aid in planning and support for Catholic communities abroad. Some plates bear penciled notes along the edges, giving names, dates, or details about the subjects. Others are unmarked, their locations now lost to memory. The glass is delicate, each plate a risk to handle, yet their clarity is remarkable, preserving not only the image, but the texture of stone, fabric, and human expression. Together they form a visual record that words alone cannot convey, a silent testimony to the Vatican's watchful presence far beyond Rome, and to cultures and landscapes now altered or gone. In a small climate-controlled room of the Apostolic Library is a set of leather-bound volumes titled Acta Nuntiaturae, containing private dispatches sent by papal nuncios to Rome during the 17th and 18th centuries. These nuncios, serving as the Pope's diplomatic envoys, reported on political developments, religious tensions, and even personal impressions of the courts where they were stationed. One volume, from 1648, covers the months leading up to the Peace of Westphalia. with detailed accounts of negotiations and the Vatican's concerns about the diminishing influence of Catholic monarchs in the newly defined European order. Another, from 1720, comes from the papal representative in Vienna, who wrote extensively about the Habsburg court, noting alliances, rivalries, and the religious policies affecting Protestant subjects. The tone of these reports varies. Some are formal and cautious, while others read almost like private diaries, with descriptions of banquets, illnesses, or the personalities of key figures. Marginal annotations in a later hand often summarize the significance of each report for Vatican policy. Many of these volumes contain information that never appeared in public records, offering an unfiltered view of how the Church assessed and responded to world events. They also reveal the complex role of the nuncio, part diplomat, part ecclesiastical overseer, part observer in foreign lands. Bound in thick leather and still carrying the faint scent of ink and sealing wax, the Acta Nuntiaturae are rarely consulted outside specialized research, yet they remain a vital thread in the tapestry of how the Vatican navigated the shifting political landscapes of early modern Europe. Deep within the Vatican's music archive is a small velvet-lined chest marked Cantus Prohibiti. Inside are handwritten scores and bound folios of hymns, motets, and liturgical compositions once banned from public performance. Some were prohibited for theological reasons, others because their melodies were adapted from secular songs considered unsuitable for worship. A delicate parchment from the late 15th century contains a mass setting attributed to a composer in the papal choir, its Kyrie built upon a popular love song of the time. Marginal notes in red ink warn that it is non aptum ad missam, not suitable for Mass. Another manuscript from the early 17th century preserves a haunting requiem composed in Spain, which was suppressed after local bishops questioned its unconventional harmonies and use of instruments not approved for funerals. There are also fragments of chant in obscure regional dialects, later replaced by standardized Latin texts during the reforms of the Council of Trent. Despite their disuse, these pieces are beautifully written, the staves and neumes inked with precision, and in some cases illuminated with miniature gold leaf initials. Many bear the signatures of papal censors, alongside terse explanations for their removal from the repertoire. Over time, some of these works resurfaced quietly in academic study, influencing modern sacred music in ways their composers could not have imagined. Yet here they remain, bound together in the dim stillness of the archive, preserved not as devotional tools but as historical artifacts, reminders that even in music, the Vatican has long balanced the tension between tradition, innovation, and the limits of what could be heard in the sacred space. In a discreet wing of the Vatican's manuscript collection lies a group of bound notebooks labeled Observationes Astronomicae 1582, 1750. These volumes are the product of Jesuit astronomers who maintained observatories in Rome, Beijing, and South America, often working in cooperation with local scholars. The earliest entries date to the year of the Gregorian calendar reform, when Vatican-backed astronomers carefully charted the movements of the sun and planets to correct centuries of drift in the Julian calendar. One notebook contains meticulous records from Father Matteo Ricci's successors in China, noting lunar eclipses alongside commentaries in both Latin and classical Chinese. Another, from the missions in Peru includes diagrams of constellations as seen from the southern hemisphere, some annotated with indigenous names. The handwriting is steady and clear, the ink still dark despite the passing centuries. Marginal notes sometimes comment on theological implications, particularly when new observations challenged long-accepted Aristotelian cosmology. While the Vatican encouraged the gathering of such data, certain findings, such as evidence supporting the heliocentric model, were handled cautiously, circulating only among trusted scholars. The pages also reveal a practical purpose. Astronomical data was essential for calculating the date of Easter and other movable feasts. Though many observatories eventually passed into secular hands, these early records survive as a testament to the Church's involvement in scientific inquiry, even when that inquiry ventured into territory fraught with doctrinal sensitivity. Today, the volumes rest in protective cases, their leather bindings faintly scented with the dust of centuries, preserving a view of the heavens as seen through the disciplined eyes of faith and reason. In a narrow wooden case in the Vatican's restricted map room lies a collection marked Tabulae Missionum 1600, 1850. These are hand-drawn maps created by missionaries, traders, and envoys who reported back to Rome from territories across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Each sheet is unique, some drawn on parchment, others on thick linen paper, their edges frayed from handling. One map from the early 17th century charts the Congo River basin, its winding course annotated with Latin names given to settlements and notes on the locations of mission stations. Another, drawn by a Jesuit in Japan before the suppression of the order in 1773, shows coastal inlets, mountain passes, and the hidden Christian communities that had survived underground after the faith was outlawed. There is a remarkable map from the Andes, with elevations carefully rendered and small illustrations of churches built at high altitudes. The maps are not purely geographical. Many include symbolic imagery crosses marking the spread of Catholic influence, stylized ships to indicate trade routes, and heraldic crests of supporting patrons in Europe. Some bear corrections in later hands, as if updated with each new expedition's findings. These maps were more than navigational tools. They were strategic records, aiding the Vatican in planning missionary efforts, managing resources, and understanding the political boundaries that shaped religious access. Preserved in low-light drawers to protect the pigments, their colors still glow indigo seas, gold leaf for important cities, and rich greens for fertile valleys. They remain a testament to an era when faith and geography were intertwined, and the Church sought to chart not only the land, but the souls within it. In a dim alcove of the Vatican's diplomatic archive is a set of sealed leather folders labeled Concordata Secreta. These contain drafts and private correspondence related to concordats, formal agreements between the Holy See and various states that were never made public. Unlike the concordats preserved in open collections, these were negotiated quietly, sometimes abandoned before signing, other times replaced with less controversial arrangements. One folder from the late 19th century outlines discussions between the Vatican and a Central European monarchy over the appointment of bishops, revealing tensions over whether the state could veto candidates. Another from the 1920s details early talks with the South American Republic regarding the Church's rights to run schools and hospitals. Negotiations halted abruptly after a change in government. Some documents include marginal notes in the hand of senior, curial officials, weighing the political cost of certain clauses, or warning against language that might weaken papal authority. Many letters are written in formal French, the diplomatic language of the period, while others are in Latin, reserved for internal deliberations. Although these agreements never took effect, their preservation suggests the Vatican valued them as precedent, or as lessons in what to avoid. Bound in thick covers and kept under lock, these folders reveal the calculated diplomacy that often took place far from public view, where faith and political pragmatism met in delicate balance. Each page is stamped with a seal of the Secretariat of State, a quiet reminder that even in failure, these negotiations formed part of the intricate web of the Church's relations with a wider world. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here. Subscribe. In the Vatican's medical archive, rarely visited even by scholars, rests a series of bound ledgers titled Relationes Sanitatis. These are detailed health reports on popes, cardinals, and senior clergy, spanning from the 17th century to the early 20th century. Compiled by papal physicians and surgeons, the entries are clinical yet often tinged with the personal impressions of the attending doctors. A volume from 1701 records the slow decline of Pope Innocent XII, noting his dietary restrictions, bouts of fever, and the remedies prescribed from herbal infusions to cupping. Another ledger from 1830 describes the final weeks of Pope Pius VIII, with daily temperature readings, pulse counts, and the treatments administered in the papal apartments. Some entries include sketches of surgical instruments or diagrams of affected organs, reflecting the medical understanding of the time. There are also curious details, recommendations for mineral baths in Tivoli, instructions for procuring exotic remedies from the East, and strict orders for periods of absolute rest, guarded from visitors. In a few cases, the reports hint at political maneuvering, with certain illnesses kept discreet to avoid unrest among the faithful or interference from foreign powers. The handwriting varies. Some entries are in the flowing cursive of 17th century physicians, others in the more compact and precise style of 19th century medical scribes. These ledgers were never intended for public release, and their preservation in controlled conditions suggests both their historical and administrative value. They reveal a side of the Vatican seldom seen, an institution concerned not only with the spiritual health of its leaders, but with the fragile human bodies upon which centuries of authority rested. In a restricted cabinet of the Vatican Library lies a collection of fragile scrolls and codices, labeled Epistolae Catacombales. These are letters and notes recovered from the Christian catacombs beneath Rome, some dating as far back as the 3rd century. Written on papyrus, parchment, or thin lead sheets, many are brief messages of remembrance or intercession, often addressed to the dead. One small fragment, found in the catacomb of Priscilla, contains a mother's prayer for her son, written in simple Latin and ending with a symbol of the fish. Another, on lead, asks for the protection of a bishop who had been martyred decades earlier, suggesting an early practice of seeking the intercession of saints. A few messages are more personal, containing news from the living to those they had lost, as though the bond between them continued unbroken. The handwriting varies from careful formal script to hurried scratches, perhaps written in secrecy during times of persecution. Some scrolls bear small drawings, a shepherd carrying a lamb, an anchor, a palm branch, symbols of hope and endurance. The preservation of these pieces is remarkable, given the damp and shifting soil in which they were buried for centuries. They were likely retrieved during excavations in the 19th century, when papal archaeologists sought to catalog the earliest material evidence of Christian devotion. Stored today in sealed cases under low light, they speak in voices that have crossed 1700 years, offering a glimpse into a faith lived quietly, often under threat, yet expressed with tenderness and persistence. In a quiet storage room of the Vatican's archival wing rests a small iron chest marked Testamenta Cardinalium. Inside are the last wills and personal bequests of cardinals dating from the 15th to the 19th century. Each is carefully folded, sealed with wax, and accompanied by a summary written by a clerk of the Apostolic Camera, the office responsible for handling church finances. Some wills are short and practical, leaving modest possessions to family or loyal servants. Others are lengthy documents filled with elaborate instructions for funeral rites, charitable donations, and the distribution of valuable manuscripts or relics. One will, from 1,565, details the donation of a cardinal's private library to a Jesuit college, including rare works of Greek philosophy and early printed Bibles. Another, from 1,789, directs that a considerable sum be used to establish a school for orphan children in Rome, a project completed after the cardinal's death. A few testaments reveal personal attachments, a ring to be returned to a childhood friend, a handwritten book of prayers for a niece entering a convent. While most requests were honored, marginal notes in some files indicate that disputes arose, occasionally requiring intervention by the Pope himself. The documents reflect both the wealth and the humanity of the men who held high office, their final instructions blending duty to the Church with private affections and unfinished intentions. Kept under strict conditions to preserve the fragile parchment, the Testamenta Cardinalium offer a rare view into the personal legacies of those whose public lives were often defined solely by rank and ceremony. In a temperature-controlled vault beneath the Apostolic Palace lies a series of volumes labeled Censura Librorum, the official records of books reviewed, altered, or banned by Vatican authorities. These registers, covering the 16th through 19th centuries, include not only theological works but also histories, scientific treatises, and poetry. Each entry lists the title, author, and language, followed by detailed notes on passages deemed problematic. Some critiques are theological, targeting interpretations that diverged from Catholic doctrine. Others focus on political content, especially in works criticizing monarchs allied with the Holy See. A notable entry from 1,633 records the condemnation of a scientific text supporting the heliocentric model, its approval revoked shortly after the trial of Galileo Galilei. Another, from 1,758, shows the removal of certain works from the Index Librorum Prohibitorum after reforms by Pope Benedict XIV, reflecting a shift in policy toward more lenient oversight. Occasionally, the censor's remarks reveal internal debate. One hand might argue for prohibition, while another recommends only minor corrections. In some cases, permission to read a banned work was granted to specific scholars, provided they had written approval from the Holy Office. Bound in calfskin and inked in an elegant yet formal script, these volumes preserve a careful balance between controlling the circulation of ideas and maintaining scholarly engagement. Today, They are consulted rarely, their pages a reminder that the written word has always been both a vessel of knowledge and, in the eyes of the Church, a force to be guided with vigilance. In a secure drawer of the Vatican's numismatic collection rests a set of coins and medals that were never meant for circulation. These pieces, known internally as proba monetarum, were trial strikes produced for papal coinage from the 16th to the 20th centuries. Crafted by skilled engravers, they were often struck in small numbers to test new designs, medals, or inscriptions before official minting. One silver trial from 1623 bears the portrait of Pope Urban VIII, its reverse showing a detailed image of St. Peter's Basilica before the completion of its facade. Another from 1870 features the crossed keys and tiara, with an experimental alloy that tarnished too quickly and was abandoned. Some medals commemorate events that were planned but never realized, such as jubilees postponed due to war or papal journeys that did not occur. Marginal notes in accompanying ledgers explain why certain designs were rejected: the image too political, the Latin phrasing unclear, or the symbolism deemed inappropriate for the intended occasion. The artistry of these coins is remarkable, even when the designs were set aside, with fine detailing in the papal features and religious emblems. Many are preserved in protective cases lined with dark velvet, their surfaces untarnished after centuries. These proba monetarum not only reveal the practical considerations of minting, but also reflect the Vatican's awareness that every symbol it placed in metal would travel far beyond Rome, carrying with it a carefully measured message. As such, even the coins that never saw the light of public exchange remain part of the Church's visual and historical legacy. In a rarely opened section of the Vatican's photographic archive lies a collection labeled Imago Missionum. These are early photographs taken by missionaries from the mid-19th to early 20th centuries, documenting both the work of the Church and the cultures they encountered. Some are mounted on stiff album pages, others preserved as fragile glass plate negatives. A series from 1867 shows Catholic missions along the Mekong River, with priests standing beside wooden chapels and local villagers posing in traditional dress. Another set from 1895 captures life in East Africa, including images of schools, marketplaces, and religious processions under makeshift canopies. The photographs are often composed with care, balancing ethnographic interest with an intention to record the spread of the faith. Captions in Latin or French provide context names of regions, dates, and sometimes the identities of those pictured. In some cases, the images reveal a blend of cultures: a carved crucifix surrounded by native motifs, or a baptism ceremony conducted beside a thatched roof hut. These photographs were sent to Rome not merely as records, but as visual reports, aiding in fundraising and inspiring support for overseas missions. The wear on the prints, fingerprints, faded edges, slight curling suggests they were handled frequently before being archived. Today, preserved in climate-controlled drawers, they offer a layered view of the era, a time when photography was still new, missions were expanding, and the Vatican sought to capture, quite literally, the meeting of worlds. Within the Vatican's ceremonial archive, an oak cabinet labeled Vestimenta Suppressa holds liturgical garments, once used in papal rites, but later retired from service. These vestments, dating from the late Middle Ages to the early 20th century, are preserved with meticulous care, each wrapped in unbleached linen to protect the delicate fabrics. Some are embroidered with gold and silver thread, their patterns depicting saints, biblical scenes, or intricate floral motifs. A chasuble from the 15th century glimmers with pearls sewn into its orphrey, its weight suggesting it was worn only on the most solemn occasions. Another piece, from the 18th century, is remarkable for its deep indigo silk, a color rarely used due to the expense of the dye. Many of these vestments were withdrawn not because of damage, but due to changes in liturgical fashion or reform, such as the simplifications following the Council of Trent and later modifications in the 19th century. Accompanying notes detail the reason for each garment's retirement, sometimes citing a desire for lighter materials or designs more in keeping with evolving aesthetic sensibilities. A few garments bear small repairs, evidence of their long service before being placed in storage. These vestments, though no longer part of the living liturgy, remain potent symbols of the ceremonial splendor that once filled the basilicas and chapels of Rome. In the stillness of the archive, their colors and textures speak of centuries when every thread was chosen not only for beauty, but to honor the divine. Deep in the Vatican's music archive, a climate-controlled cabinet holds manuscripts marked Cantus Reservatus. These are choral works and liturgical compositions once performed within the Sistine Chapel and other sacred spaces, but never released beyond the papal court. Many date from the Renaissance and Baroque periods, their notation penned in precise black ink on white staves, with occasional illuminations framing the opening letters. Some scores are by known masters Palestrina, Allegri, and their contemporaries, while others bear only initials or remain entirely anonymous. One vellum folio from the early 17th century contains an alternative setting of Miserere me, Deus, with subtle harmonic shifts not found in the famous version sung each Holy Week. Marginal notes suggest these variations were meant for specific papal ceremonies and restricted audiences. The practice of reserving certain music to the Vatican ensured an air of exclusivity and reverence, but also protected the works from unauthorized adaptation. It is said that some pieces were guarded so closely that copying them without permission risked severe penalties. Over time, fragments of these melodies escaped into the wider world, often carried in memory by choir members, but the complete manuscripts remained locked away. Today, the Cantus Reservatus are preserved under soft light, their pages turned only by gloved hands, each note a quiet echo of centuries-old worship. They stand as reminders that even within the universal church, certain sounds were once meant to be heard only within its most sacred walls. In a restricted corner of the Vatican's diplomatic records lies a set of parchment-bound dossiers titled Legations Extraordinariae. These files document extraordinary papal legations, special diplomatic missions dispatched during crises or moments of delicate negotiation, often outside the routine work of the nuncios. The earliest volume, from 1527, concerns envoys sent to broker peace between warring Italian states in the aftermath of the sack of Rome. Another, from 1648, details Vatican involvement in the complex negotiations surrounding the Peace of Westphalia, even though the Holy See ultimately refused to ratify the treaties. The dossiers include letters of instruction from the Pope, sealed in wax, as well as detailed reports from the envoys describing the political climates they encountered. Some accounts read almost like travel journals, noting the state of roads, weather conditions, and the reception given by foreign courts. Others focused sharply on the exchange of gifts, a critical element of diplomacy at the time. Gold chalices, illuminated manuscripts, and even relics carefully chosen to flatter or persuade. Occasionally, the records reveal missions that failed, their goals undone by sudden wars, assassinations, or shifts in allegiance. Marginal notes in several files suggest that intelligence gathering was an unspoken but important part of these journeys. Today, the Legaciones Extraordinariae remain sealed to casual visitors, their faded ink and careful script preserving a record of how the Vatican extended its influence in times when personal presence could carry more weight than letters alone. In the Vatican's underground archive of natural history, a set of cabinets bears the unassuming label Specimina Missionaria. Inside are collections of plants, minerals, and small animal specimens sent to Rome by missionaries from the 17th to the 19th century. Each specimen is stored with a handwritten description, often in Latin, noting its place of origin, local uses, and any observations of interest. A pressed orchid from the Philippines, sent in 1704, is accompanied by a note describing its role in indigenous medicinal practices. A mineral sample from the Andes is marked with a careful sketch showing how it was extracted, along with speculation about its potential for church ornamentation. Some entries are unexpectedly personal. A shell from the coast of Africa, presented as a keepsake to a cardinal who supported the mission financially, or a small bird's feather included as a token of goodwill. These collections were more than curiosities. They reflected the Vatican's interest in cataloging the natural world as part of its understanding of creation, and in some cases served practical purposes for medicine, architecture, or art. Over time, a few specimens became valuable for science, especially when they represented species later found to be rare or endangered. The Specimina Missionaria are preserved today in climate-controlled cases, their colors muted but still distinct after centuries. They remain a quiet record of how faith, curiosity, and the desire to document the wonders of distant lands converged in the heart of Rome. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.